Okay, I've finally given up on the idea of doing a short video. I just can't help myself. We're looking at John 4, and we're looking at the woman of Samaria, of course. And I like to remind us whenever we come across any kind of passage that we should look back to chapter 1, to the prologue, because there are so many themes there which are then reflected throughout the gospel. And you think of 1 verse 13, children born not of natural descent nor human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Remember that the message throughout these passages is that what matters is faith in God, not your pedigree. Okay, so we've seen that. I think we've emphasized that enough, that it's not to do with being Jewish. It doesn't matter if you're Gentile or even, in this case, Samaritan. And then in the next passage you have an Herodian. Herod was absolutely hated by the Jews. And so this whole point is that you've got a Jew who's searching in Nicodemus, and then you've got Samaritan who gets saved, Herodian who receives the healing, and then it goes on into chapter 5. You've got somebody by the pool who's Jewish but he's ungrateful. So I've already mentioned that a few times, but this is what being born again really means. Okay, this is what it's all explaining. And this is the message that really comes across, is that faith is what makes the difference. Okay, now it's significant that you've got somebody who's a Samaritan. Quick potted history. Of course, once upon a time, the 12 tribes took over the area of Canaan, and that became Israel. And then in the days of the kings, they split into two. You had Israel in the north, 10 tribes, and Judah in the south, which was effectively 2 tribes. But you also had Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, and a few others mixed in there. But essentially, they were 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And then in the north, you had supposedly 10 tribes, although of course it was a bit mixed up because Joseph had become Manasseh and Ephraim, and so they became 2 half tribes. And it's the case that you've got quite a mixed sort of a history there, because of course we're all aware of the Jews who were in the south. They were taken away by Babylon, and then after 70 years they came back, and they are the people that we know as the Jews, Jews being short for Judah. Okay. The tribes in the north, however, had a completely different history, which is often overlooked by biblical, in biblical history, in the sense that they were taken away by Assyria, and they were put somewhere in the Assyrian Empire that went all the way to Burma. And as such, they seem to drop off the face of the earth. They seem to disappear from history. And many people assume that they just disappeared and blended into the Gentile populations around there and became as effectively Gentile. That is not the case, however. Josephus, who was a historian writing at the time of Jesus, said that they were without number, and we read other books in the Apocrypha, like the book of Tobit. You see that they kept their identity as Israelites, they kept their tribal system, they kept their customs, they wouldn't marry outsiders, but that they were, they were prospering, and they were well known. And in fact, in the New Testament, of course, you've got the book of James, which is addressed to the 12 tribes. And a lot of people read that and say, James was talking to the Jews. No, he wasn't. He was talking to the 12 tribes, because the people from the northern tribes are not Jews. They are Israelites, because they're from the other 10 tribes. Okay, so the case is that you've got this mixed history. Right? Now, in the north of Israel, the Assyrians took them out, okay, but then they brought some Gentiles in. Now, the Gentiles who came in were pagans, of course. They didn't worship God, and they found that they couldn't get things to go right. They kept being attacked by wild animals and stuff, and they felt that they were displeasing the God of the land. Okay, they were thinking in very pagan terms. So they asked the Assyrians to send some Levites back, which they did, who taught them how to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel. The problem was they mixed it with their paganism. And so you ended up with these people who were both religiously and genetically hybrid. They were pagans mixing with the worship of the God of Israel, and they were Gentiles who'd mixed their genetics with the remaining Israelites. Okay, and so they were an impure breed in the eyes of the Jews, who consider themselves to be superior and pedigree, right? And so we see that played out in Nehemiah and Jeremiah, not Jeremiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, where these people, the local people, tried to join in with the rebuilding of the temple, and the Jews rejected them. Okay, which was unjustified, by the way. A lot of people assume that because Ezra was doing it, we assume that it was a good thing. But remember that the prophet who wrote at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah was Malachi, with that infamous quote, "I hate divorce." All right. So, with the rejection of the Samaritans, they also rejected Gentiles from amongst them, or the people that they thought were Gentiles. What they should have done was found out those who had faith in God. And it shouldn't matter if they were Jewish or Gentile. What mattered was their faith in God. Okay. So anyway, there was this hatred between the Jews and the Gentiles, and they even went to war over it, and they just hated each other. And that was a significance, of course, in the parable of the Good Samaritan. All right. So then we come to this woman in Samaria, and in fact, the understanding is that she's come at a certain time of day because she's hated by other women. She obviously has a bad reputation. She's had several relationships, and so therefore, there's a lot of stigma attached to this woman. All right. It was also unusual, apparently, for rabbis to talk to women in the way that Jesus did. And in this situation, of course, he actually is on his own with a Samaritan who's hated by the Jews, with a woman of ill repute, which would be disdained by religious Jews, and he even asked to drink after her, which would have been, unheard of. And even the disciples are embarrassed when they come back and they find him talking to a woman. It's like rabbis don't do that, But Jesus shows that he cares nothing for social convention or what people think or what people say. He is going to reach out to those who are hated and marginalized by society. All right, and this is what it's all about. Okay, the reminder is, of course, that the Jews should not have thought of themselves as superior, because after all, what was Abraham? He was a wandering Aramaean, and when you look into the Old Testament, there are times where God declares to them that they should not think of themselves more highly than themselves. God didn't choose them because they were special. They were just ordinary people. They were unrighteous and contentious, but God had chosen them because he was special. All right. So this is the important thing about this whole background to this story, which of course is missed on modern men, but if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you're probably familiar with most of that. All right. Now the conversation centers around water. Okay. And there's this expression, living water. Now, living water could just be an expression for running fresh water. You know yourself, if you go to a puddle or a pond and it's stagnant and stale and probably a bit warm where the sunlight's been on it, it's not very nice to drink, okay? Whereas when you go to a bubbling stream, of course, the water taste is fresh, full of oxygen, and it's cooler, hopefully, and so on and so forth, all right? Now, the water in the well, which might be a well that they've dug up in recent years, it's about 130 something feet deep. It's got a spiral staircase going down to it, and it kind of compounds the fact that in the middle of the day this lady has come with her jars and she would have to go down and get water and carry it back up those steps and then carry it back to the town, or back to her home. It's not very nice prospect, and so the idea of running water would be lovely. However, Jesus, of course, actually is talking about something much greater, because of course he's talking about water that brings eternal life. Okay, so you're probably beginning to pick up a similar theme as the way that Nicodemus's thinking starts off on a basic natural birth. Then Jesus sort of draws him out of that to the idea of being born of the Spirit, so he tries to raise his thinking. And here we see that she's thinking about natural water. Even running water would be nice, but Jesus has something even better than that. And of course we're going to see that in John chapter 6 as well, where you've got bread and the people want bread, and Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And so he's elevating their thinking, and this is where John goes with many of these things. They understand that Jesus is talking about something natural, but then he takes them up a step. He wants us to raise our thinking up a level, up a gear, to think about something spiritual. All right, and this is the way that every conversation in John seems to go. Lift up your thinking, try to think above the natural, okay, and try to look for things which are to do with the kingdom. And of course, actually, that goes hand in hand with the ancestry thing. We're reminded that this is a well that Jacob gave to Joseph, and that it's something that was part of the history of Israel. The history of Israel is something that the Jews were extremely proud of. This is our land, this is what we've done, our ancestors gave us this, all these things, looking back into the past. But Jesus has come to give something even better. You look back and you think, oh, Jacob gave us this well. Wasn't he fantastic? Could anybody be greater than the person who gave us this well? What a fantastic achievement. Jesus has something much, much better, right? And so therefore you begin to see that loosening of the grip that history and heritage had, because it's not about your past heritage that really matters, it's about your future inheritance. That's what really matters. I just thought of that. That was really good. I'm amazing. My son is laughing at me. All right then. Okay. So yes, it's not your past heritage that matters, it's your future inheritance. All right then. I wish I was amazing. That's your cue to say you are, Dad. No, silence. All right, thanks. All right then. So Jesus challenges her to really think at a much higher level. Right? Now, it's often the case that we see that Jesus confronts people about certain things in their life, but we shouldn't misunderstand this. Here he challenges her about the number of husbands that she's had, and the fact that the man that she's now with is not even married to her. But the thing is, sometimes we misunderstand what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is giving her a very clear message. Twofold, really. One, I know all about you. But two, I'm still interested and I'm still here to save you. I'm not going to reject you. Now, this is a woman who's used to rejection. Okay? This is somebody who's used to being pushed away. But as soon as, she probably hides who she is, and then when people find out who she is, then they push her away. With Jesus, it's the opposite. He already knows beforehand, right? She tries to hide who she is, right? To some extent, I have no husband, but she doesn't come out with the full truth, But the thing is, it's like Jesus wants to get across that he's still concerned about her. He still wants her. Now, this is the way that we should preach the gospel. Sometimes we come across as being like God's policemen, going around like traffic wardens, telling people what they've done wrong, what infringements they've done this, they've done that, you're wrong for this, you're wrong for that, you're a sinner, we're all sinners, even if you include yourself in that, I'm a sinner, right? What we really need to get, you see, because as soon as people think, oh, well, if God knows that I'm a sinner, he's not going to want me. And that's the way that we come across. We come across like we're rejecting people when we lambast people about their sin, right? What we should be doing is getting across the message that we know that you're a sinner, but it doesn't matter. It's going to be behind you, because we're more interested in your future. God is interested in what you can be, not what you are. All right? And so therefore God is interested in redemption. And this is really important. All right? To get that across is a real skill when it comes to witnessing and preaching the gospel. All right, so there's this debate here about worshipping on this mountain or that mountain. Should it be the Jerusalem temple or in the temple that's in northern Israel, in Samaria? And there's this ongoing debate. Jesus sweeps all of that aside. because the hour is coming when you will worship neither here nor there, because it doesn't matter. What really matters is the new temple. Of course, in John 2 we saw the new temple. You're going to destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And of course, what was he talking about? He was talking about himself. All right, so there's this beautiful picture here that actually freedom is coming to worship. Once upon a time, Abraham worshipped God wherever he went. He would go to a place and he'd build an altar, and he travelled up and down through Canaan and he built an altar and he'd worship the Lord. Okay, and there was freedom. And then in came the law, the tabernacle, the temple, and everything came locked to one place. When the kingdom split into two, north and south, of course, you had the Jerusalem temple made by Solomon, but then up in the north, then Jeroboam built another place to worship, right? And it split things, right? But that wasn't freedom. There was still, you have to worship here, you have to worship there, and there were debates about where that was, okay? But the point is that Jesus is taking us back to Abraham, okay? He's not taking us back to Moses, he's not taking us back to Israel, he's taking us back to Abraham, okay, where salvation is by faith and there's complete freedom. For the simple reason that we're going back to having a temple that is actually ourselves. Okay, Jesus is the new temple, we are the new temple, and the rivers will flow from within. We're going to look at Ezekiel when we get into John 7, and the rivers flowing from the temple. And, all of that is fulfilled. All of that stuff in the Old Testament is fulfilled in this. All right. So, let's move on. Right, so here we go. There's this thing about worshipping in spirit and truth, and that's what really matters, and that God is seeking a people to worship him. He's not seeking people to make sacrifices and do ceremonies and build buildings. He's looking for people to worship him. Now, the woman is obviously a little bit taken back by all of this, and it's like, whoa, what is this, right? And so in typical form, she kind of dismisses it all, and they're like, I'll understand one day. I'll understand when the Messiah comes, right? Again, just as a side note, you notice that Messiah is explained as Christ. So clearly John was expecting some of his readers not to know what the word Messiah meant. All right, that's a Hebrew word meaning anointed, and then you have the Greek word meaning anointed. Okay, so it's the same thing. So really, it would be better to say he who is called anointed. All right, and she says, he'll tell us when he gets here. And Jesus says, no, he doesn't say this. This is an awful translation. Okay, he actually just says simply the Greek words ego eimi. Okay, ego eimi. Okay, he actually just says I am. Okay, and that's a Greek translation of the Hebrew echye, which is from Exodus 3, I am, where God says I am who I am. All right, and so actually it's worth bearing in mind that this is the first of the I am sayings, and I'm going to do a separate video on the I am sayings, which will come next. Let's just finish off this passage. As I said before, the disciples were shocked that she was talking to a woman, and it's obviously not normal rabbinical behaviour. But she's gone off. She's left her water jars, by the way. It's often popular to say she came there with jars empty and went away with them full. No, she didn't. She dumped them where they were, right? Because she had something much greater. She'd found out that the Christ was here, the Messiah was here, and that he knew everything about her and still wanted to talk to her. Okay, so that was exciting to her, and she's gone and told everybody. All right, we could have a debate there about women preaching. Let's not bother, but for the simple reason that preaching is different from teaching, and we often don't make the difference, so we're not going to get caught up in that. Every Christian, man or woman, should be going out and testifying, sharing, declaring who Jesus is, right? We're not talking about teaching in the ministry, all right, or in leadership. But I said we wouldn't have a debate about that, so let's not. Meanwhile, the disciples say, Rabbi, eat, and he says, I have food to eat that you do not know about. Okay, again, Jesus is talking about something spiritual, right? And the disciples, in typical manner, think he's talking about something natural. Somebody bought him a sandwich or something. And Jesus explains, my food is to do the will of him who sent me, okay, and to accomplish his work. Oh, that was what sustained us. Oh, if only that was all that we want in life, you know. Of course, for Jesus, he's seen here so vastly superior to the disciples who were thinking about filling their stomachs. Here they are, you know, and he is a shining light compared to their dull, flickering wicks, you know. But the point is that we should also feel the same way, but not in a way to discourage us, but to realise I really need to accomplish so much more in my life, you know. There's so much more to life. And so he calls for workers to the harvest field and moves on from there. All right. Now, I could go more into this, but actually I'm going to move on to the next passage after I've spoken about the I am sayings, because otherwise I'm just going to get bogged down and it's going way too long. But the point is that people come here and they believe in Jesus. They believe that he's the saviour of the world. This is a great expression, okay, that you find here. And, you know, this is the declaration of the gospel. All right. So, see you next time.